Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Candace Rondeaux. She's a senior director, Future Frontlines and Planetary Politics, and professor of practice at Arizona State University, author of her latest Putin Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group, and Russia's Collapse into Mercenary Chaos. Candace, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's, I want to get into your book a little bit, but broadly speaking, give us your assessment of where we're at in terms of the capacity both for Russia and Ukraine to maintain these fighting. I mean, things with Donald Trump, it feels like changes week to week in terms of our support of Ukraine, and it's sometimes hard to know how much of this is real and how much of it is sort of some type of posturing, and for whom even that posturing would be. But what's your assessment?
Well, one thing I think that's really important to understand, it doesn't really matter, if Trump is up or down one day, or even if Putin is up or down one day. The Ukrainians are very determined to keep fighting this war. Yes, they have challenges with munitions, they have challenges with arms. The onslaught of attacks that we've seen in the last month or so, drone attacks on Kiev, 700 drones launched in one particular instance, certainly is having an impact on the psychology and the morale of Ukraine for sure. At the same time, the struggle is existential for a lot of Ukrainians. And yes, there are cracks in the surface, certainly when it comes to unity. I think there's a lot of questions about Volodymyr Zelensky's staying capacity, just politically speaking, because he's over his term as president. But structurally speaking, this war is really for Ukraine an existential war, and in which most Ukrainians agree that capitulation to Putin, whether in the form of a ceasefire that's temporary or something bigger, ultimately means the erasure of their civilization and their culture. On Putin's side, he is determined to.
Can I ask you before we get to Putin's side? Do you have a sense, and is there any way to know, like, what constitutes the threshold for what is the existential threshold? In other words, like, how much, where does it cross over that? Are we talking about the Donbass? Are we talking about Crimea? Are we talking about, like, at what point does it become existential, or is it on the the sort of the pre-2014 borders?
Well, that's hard to say. I will say that the attacks on Dnipro, which is, of course, a town at the threshold in the east near Donbass, I think a lot of Ukrainians have long thought of Dnipro as kind of the furthest edge of sort of democratic Ukraine. I would also say that anything that looked like the fall of Odessa, where essentially Ukraine would be unable to really access its way to the Black Sea, and the ports there, which of course are extremely important for export of grains and other materials. It's how the economy survives, basically. Something that sort of changed the status of Dnipro and changed the status of Odessa, I think would call into question the current state of this strategy in Ukraine.
Okay, fair enough. And so, give me what you were about to give us an assessment of Putin and Russia. What is that?
So much like Donald Trump, you have to kind of look at Putin in terms of his rhetoric and then his actions. And you have to find a way to square the two, which often doesn't really compute, right? It doesn't really work out. There's a lot of irrationality and illogic on the surface when you look only at the rhetoric. Putin has shown through his actions that he has continued to press and press and press whatever little advantage Russian troops have in the east. And we have seen incremental gains, to the tune of sometimes meters a day, occasionally miles a month. And so we have now not exactly momentum, because that would suggest that things are moving really fast. And obviously, we're 3 years into what was supposed to be a 3-day war, and things aren't moving as fast as Putin had hoped. But I think he sees that in addition to this incremental gain on the territorial front, there's also political gains with the unity or disunity of NATO. And we've seen that on display again and again. I would argue that the NATO summit that we just had in June was a pretty good sign of the continued disunity that Putin is hoping to exploit and expand. We don't have, unity on the spending. We don't have unity on the deployment of weapons. The only shift that we've really seen is obviously Donald Trump's most recent statement that, Patriot missiles would be sold, missile batteries would be sold to Europe, and other munitions would be sold to Europe as a kind of proxy and a stopgap measure. But Putin has shown that he is willing to go pretty far. He has made an alliance with North Korea. We've seen North Korean troops inserted into Kursk, right, into that border region near Ukraine. We've seen African troops even. We've seen deals with Iran to build, large-scale drone factories. We've seen cooperation with China. So the determination is there, even if the resources are not. And I think ultimately what we're starting to see also, though, are cracks within the economy. These sanctions are starting to bite, are starting to have an effect. There was a meeting just last month involving, Russia's economists, economics ministers, and central bank, making some pretty grim, prognostications about the state of the economy. 21% inflation, nobody can sustain that, right? So I think the concern here now is, will this 50-day marker that Trump has thrown down, come and go without any additional sanctions, the third country sanctions that have been long threatened? And if they are put in place, what's going to be the effect on the global economy? And how long can the United States and NATO kind of withstand, most likely, the political pressures that would come because of the prices at the gas pump that would be evident right after those sanctions were put in place?
And are there political threats for Putin in this context, or is there a system such that he spends an inordinate amount of time making sure that those threats are, in one fashion or another, neutralized, for lack of a better word?
One thing that the Wagner Group experience kind of gives us as a lesson is that Putin's regime is extremely brittle, and the security regime is very fragile. He is always, like many other rulers in Russia before him, worried about the potential for a coup or some sort of internal rebellion. And of course, a war of this scale always raises that threshold of risk. Because if it doesn't go well, and it hasn't, there have been almost 1 million casualties, or more actually, now on the Russian side, and about 400 to 500,000 on the Ukrainian side. Those are big numbers, and they're not the kinds of numbers that you can just easily hide or brush away. So I think that concern about the fragility of this sort of internal security and the people that he surrounds himself with is always a serious concern for Putin. And to some degree, I think it may be one reason why we've seen, for example, some of the escalation in sabotage attacks across Europe, which suggests to me a certain level of desperation to change the terms of the war, expand it beyond Ukrainian territory, and pull Europe deeper in to a conflict that it doesn't really know if it wants to fight.
Let's talk about that, because that there was just, I guess it was last week, that there were 3 British nationals who were arrested, ostensibly working for the Wagner Group, involved in some type of espionage. How widespread is this? Because I don't know that we hear that much about it. And how effective is it? Is the idea that it's supposed to make Europeans less interested in supporting Ukraine, or like fearful that they're being drawn in to create that sort of, I guess, fear? Or it seems to me it could also cut the other way, where if there's a genuine fear that, and my sense is, I haven't had a lot of conversations about this, but from what I've heard, I know Europeans who have a genuine fear that Russia is going to come rolling through Europe. I mean, I don't know how rational that is, but that seems to be in the air. Give us a sense of what the Wagner Group has been up to in terms of that type of espionage, and if it's having its desired effect.
Yeah, so the three nationals that you're referencing who were just arrested, they were charged with firebombing a car that used to belong to the Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer, and also a property that I guess he still owns but belongs to another family member. And what's interesting about that is actually all of that kind of unfolded the week that I was in London covering a case, a different case entirely linked to the Wagner Group, involving the prosecution of a total of 8 British guys, young men, all of them with the exception of one, who had also been recruited via Telegram and a Wagner Group affiliated channel known as the Gray Zone. And it seems in both of these instances, the Wagner Group sort of figured very prominently, mostly as kind of the bait for young men who were kind of looking around for something to do. And the tactics have been seen in other places. I also covered a case in Poland, in Krakow, involving 2 Russian nationals who were fomenting Wagner Group propaganda. This is, just as Wagner was falling apart in 2023, summer of 2023, these 2 guys were also arrested. So the Wagner Group brand is still very much alive and still deployed and used by the GRU intelligence wing, which is kind of the main arm of the military intelligence of the Kremlin. And although the actual organization itself, or the network that propped up the organization, has more or less, been reorganized into 3 or 4 different branches, including most notoriously the Africa Corps, where Wagner-affiliated forces now fall under this broad rubric of expeditionary forces in places like Mali and Central African Republic and so forth. So Wagner is still alive as an idea and as a brand. And, the GRU has been very good at exploiting its reputation to attract people to undertake criminal enterprises that ultimately result in sabotage. They do pay. They pay in crypto.
So the GRU sort of just runs it through, I guess, for lack of a better term, shell brand of the Wagner Group at this point.
Exactly. Yeah, they pay, and they pay, for criminals, who are in their 20s, getting $5,000 or $10,000 to, set fire to a warehouse with Starlink components in it is, pretty good money. But to answer your question about sort of like what's the strategic purpose of all of this, it's twofold. One, it is certainly devised to slow down deliveries of things that are really important to the front, including Starlink terminals. I'll just note that Starlink figures in several different sabotage cases, including potentially the incendiary devices that were found on DHL cargo planes a couple months back, both in Germany and then on the way to the United States and Canada. So there's clearly a kind of tactical goal in slowing down the delivery of important goods to the front, but there's also the psychological effect. And that is to kind of say, we are everywhere. We can reach deep beyond, our own borders, beyond Ukraine's borders, and we can penetrate. And we can expose the weaknesses of, an alliance that says that it is not at war with Russia, but Russia believes that it is at war with that. So it's kind of an interesting sort of asymmetry of conceptions of exactly what's going on.
How much impact has it had tactically, and how much impact has it had? I mean, it doesn't feel like strategically it's had that much of an impact, but maybe that's just because we're sitting here and, don't hear that much of the news. I guess we would see it strategically more if we were maybe situated in Europe and reading European news. But Tactically and strategically, how effective has this been?
So tactically, I could say it's probably been pretty effective at the sort of level of taking out logistics hubs and raising the cost for those who service Ukraine. I talked to some of the victims in the East London case where this warehouse was burned down. It was a nice Ukrainian couple who'd been, emigrated to the UK years and years ago to start their own logistics business. And, they're basically operating at 1/3 of the rate that they were a couple of years ago. And this is largely because of the strain put on the logistics lines. And in fact, one of the guys that I talked with, who was the manager at the warehouse, said, he was actually on his way to Minsk to meet with other Ukraine logistics providers because they were really in crisis over the raised cost, first of all, for insurance, for bringing things to the front line, but then also the depletion of demand simply because, people are afraid of sending things over. So it certainly has had a tactical effect on some level. Then I think the strategic effect has been to really test the intelligence coordination between these rather disparate countries that, frankly, the United Kingdom is no longer part of Europe. And so now finds itself in the crosshairs at a time when it, has weakened capacity to really coordinate with its other NATO partners. And the strain, of course, with the United States under Trump has not helped things. So I think it's had an effect, but it's true that if you're not sitting in London or Brussels, it's harder to kind of see it up close.
And it is, in terms of like how Russia is selling this to the public, you touched on it briefly, but is it framed as this kind of battle with the United States by proxy? Is it about the Western world? What are some of the kind of domestic arguments that Russians are hearing about this multi-year-long war at this point?
This is 100% a war against the West and the United States first. And that is always the bigger picture and has been for a very long time. Putin was, I think, probably not as convincing with that rhetoric when the invasion of Crimea happened in 2014. And there are a lot of reasons for that, simply because actually you didn't see much of a united response from the United States and Europe. It was sort of a little bit patchy. However, since then, of course, there have been sanctions. There have been a real targeting of the economy of Russia. And so on some level, after 8 years of all of that, it has convinced a certain part of the population that the forever war is with the United States and NATO. However, I think that there is still, there's a lot of conflict, I think, psychologically for Russians. It would be a little bit like if we went to war with Canada and tried to make it our 51st state, right? I mean, it would be really hard for us to kind of look across the border and not see a version of ourselves. And I think the Russians really experience that when they think about Ukraine and vice versa. There are really lots of close ethnic and family ties. So it's really challenging. Ukraine itself, on the one hand, seems to have kind of fallen under this kind of rhetoric for the domestic audience in Russia being sort of this neo-Nazi, new enterprising sort of government under Zelensky. Of course, that's ridiculous. But it can be convincing enough when you have this kind of psychological tension and cognitive dissonance going on.
How much, from your perspective, I mean, I understand from the Russian perspective, this has been a war waged against the United States and in the West. How much from the perspective of the West and the United States has this become a proxy battle and an offensive one, let's put it that way, as opposed to, an agenda that was sort of like foisted on them? Because my sense, I still remember Barack Obama in 2012 laughing at Mitt Romney when Mitt Romney says Russia is our number one foe. And I certainly got the sense that at least from that administration, they wanted to make China our foe. That Russia was just a, whatever. It's not going to have that much of an impact.
Right. A regional power, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of faded faded in its capacity to really challenge the United States, is roughly what Obama said. The problem, listen, this is not just an Obama problem. It's not a Trump problem. It's not a Biden problem. The problem inside Washington with the way we conceive of the tensions with Russia and China is that we kind of think that they need to be somehow, they can be divided from each other. And there's a failure to understand, especially now, how closely Russia and China have drawn closer to each other economically, politically, how dependent Russia is now on China for purchases of oil and energy, as well as for exports of dual-use technologies that it needs to fight its war in Ukraine. The fundamental kind of structural flaw in the way Washington's foreign policy establishment has thought about the war is that you can divide the two, and somehow even this talk of like a reverse Kissinger move to kind of isolate China by pulling Russia closer into the orbit of the United States through some sort of progressive appeasement of Putin and his demands vis-a-vis Ukraine and Europe. It's not going to work for so many different reasons, but largely because of that inextricable bound between China and Russia economically, which only grows by the day. The more Russia sinks economically, the more it needs outside help. And it's not going to get it from the United States, right? So the challenge is, how do you fight a war that nobody believes is actually happening? And I think you're right, Sam, that the United States and its allies, although increasingly Europe, I think, seems to have now a new mind of its own. But certainly until very recently, the West has sort of kind of taken on this idea that the war is defensive and the fate of the outcome of the war is really up to the Ukrainians. And we've seen this movie before in Afghanistan. We've seen it in Iraq. It's sort of like we don't really want to own fully the full outcome and implications of wars that we both finance and try and fight through proxies.
Lastly, I got to ask you about this because it comes up obviously in your book, which outlines, I guess, the rise and the fall of the Wagner Group. But one thing that just stuck out for me was that the Internet Research Agency was launched. I don't know if it was specifically the Wagner Group as branded that way, but it was launched by Prigozhin, and we just had Tulsi Gabbard come out. Now, granted, this is Project Forget About Jeffrey Epstein, but claim that the Obama administration lied to the American public when they said that there was evidence of Russian interference in the election via largely the Internet Research Agency. She's claiming that they said this even though they had evidence that Russia was not able to hack the elections in terms of like literally change the vote count. So there's a little bit of a conflation there. But tell us about what that role was in 2016 in participating in the election, the 2016 election.
So the reality is, no matter what Gabbard says, the Internet Research Agency's interference campaign in the 2016 election actually predates 2016. As far back as 2014, late 2014, there was evidence of Facebook accounts that were, stood up under sort of fake and false enterprises by parts of the troll farm that belonged to Glavset, which was kind of the original name of the company, now known as the Internet Research Agency. And it was a bit of an experiment. And it was an experiment in exploiting some marketing and advertisement campaigns online, exploiting weaknesses within Facebook's content moderation, and then also Twitter, Instagram, some other places as well. It was a pretty vast and sprawling enterprise Didn't cost very much, only a few $100,000, as far as we know. But what we do know is that, thousands of fake accounts were spun up on social media sites, and they were used to create divisions between Americans, over not just the elections, but all kinds of issues. Russians really use these very divisive techniques, using Black Lives Matter activists and kind of corralling the opinion of also white supremacists on the other side, getting people to show up at anti-Hillary Clinton protests. It was kind of remarkable, the breadth of it. And as you probably know, and I sort of talk about this in the book, a couple of years after all of this unfolds, there was actually a court case against Yevgeny Prigozhin and several others who were implicated in the Internet Research Agency plot. Ultimately, the government, and this was, of course, the Mueller investigation, the prosecutors who were leading that, ultimately the prosecutors were forced to drop the case because they would have had to reveal so much about their sources and information that it wasn't worth it. So there's this kind of a kind of gray mailing that was happening, where revealing classified evidence would be much more of a threat to the overall national security than actually prosecuting the case in the first place. It's a really complicated situation, but I can say with confidence that Gabbard is simply wrong. And there was plenty of evidence available still today. There's a digital trail showing how closely Yevgeny Prigozhin was involved in fomenting this campaign to disrupt the elections in 2016.
It's fascinating stuff. We will put a link to Putin's Sledgehammer, the Wagner Group, and Russia's collapse into mercenary chaos. Candace Rondeaux, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.